The Galactic Assembly hung in the void like a jewel of impossible engineering, a space station larger than most moons, where the light of 1,000 different suns reflected off its crystalline spires. Within its grand chamber, representatives from 347 species gathered in an atmosphere thick with tension. The air processors worked overtime to accommodate the varying atmospheric requirements, creating invisible zones where methane breathers could exist alongside oxygen users, where high-pressure beings could stand mere meters from vacuum-adapted species. Supreme Warlord Zhal'rix of the Drexar Hegemony stood at the central podium, his four arms spread wide in a gesture that his species used to display dominance. He was massive even by Drexar standards, his exoskeleton bearing the scars of 100 battles, each one a story of victory. His translator implant rendered his clicking speech into the common language, but it couldn't hide the contempt that dripped from every word. For 10 cycles, the Drexar hegemony has expanded across this galaxy, Zhal'rix announced, his voice reverberating through the chamber. We have brought order to 412 systems. We have unified fractured civilizations under one banner. We have proven that strength, not diplomacy, is the only true currency of power. The chamber remained silent. Everyone present knew the Drexar's expansion had been anything but peaceful. Worlds that resisted were bombarded from orbit. Species that refused to submit were scattered to the stars, their homeworlds claimed by Drexar colonists. The hegemony didn't just conquer, it consumed. 5 major powers remain independent, Zhal'rix continued. The Vexthari Collective, the Talgoran Federation, the Xel'Noth Dominion, the Chorus Unity. He paused, his multifaceted eyes scanning the chamber until they found the human delegation. And humanity. Ambassador Elena Vasquez sat perfectly still in the human section, her dark eyes fixed on the warlord. She was a career diplomat, 53 years old, with silver streaking through her black hair. She had spent 30 years in the diplomatic corps, negotiating treaties, mediating disputes, building the intricate web of relationships that had allowed humanity to thrive in galactic society despite being the newest spacefaring species. She had seen conflicts resolved with words, wars prevented through compromise. But she had also studied history, and she knew that some conflicts couldn't be avoided. I offer each of you a simple choice, Zhal'rix said. In 30 standard days, you will demonstrate your most powerful weapon. Show me why the Drexar hegemony should treat you as equals rather than subjects. Impress me, and we will discuss alliance. Fail to impress me, and you will submit to hegemony authority or face the consequences. The chamber erupted in a cacophony of responses, 300 different species all speaking at once through their translators. Some voices expressed outrage, others fear, still others a grim acceptance. The Drexar had never issued such a challenge before. Their pattern had always been simple: identify a target, invade, conquer. This public ultimatum was something new, and its implications rippled through the assembly like shock waves. Vasquez stood slowly, waiting for the noise to subside. When she spoke, her voice was calm, almost conversational. The United Nations of Earth accepts your challenge, Warlord Zhal'rix. We will present our demonstration in 30 days. Zhal'rix's mandibles clicked in what his species used for laughter. I look forward to it, Ambassador. I have heard much about humanity's diplomatic skills. I am curious to see if your military capabilities are equally impressive. As the assembly dissolved into smaller discussions and frantic diplomatic exchanges, Zhal'rix, intelligence coordinator for the Drexar hegemony, watched the human delegation from across the chamber. He was smaller than Zhal'rix, his exoskeleton marked with the silver patterns that denoted his role as a strategist rather than a warrior. Where Zhal'rix saw the galaxy in terms of dominance and submission, Zhal'rix saw it as an intricate puzzle of variables, probabilities, and patterns. He had studied all 5 of the challenged species extensively. The Vexthari would showcase their reality manipulation technology, almost certainly. The Talgoran would demonstrate their drone swarms. The Xel'Noth would reveal some bioweapon. The Chorus would display their resonance weaponry, all predictable, all quantifiable. But humanity, they were an anomaly. 300 years in space, and they'd avoided major conflicts through negotiation and economic integration. They had no superweapons in their arsenal, no revolutionary technology. Their fleet was modest, their weapons conventional. By every metric that mattered to military analysis, they were the weakest of the five powers. Yet something nagged at Zhal'rix as he watched Ambassador Vasquez calmly gather her delegation and exit the chamber. There was no panic in her movements, no fear in her eyes, just a quiet determination that he couldn't quite categorize. Back on Earth, in the sprawling complex of the United Nations Defense Coordination Center, buried deep beneath the Swiss Alps, Captain James Torres stared at the message that had just arrived from Ambassador Vasquez. He read it 3 times, certain he must be misunderstanding. "She wants what?" Admiral Chen asked, looking over Torres' shoulder at the screen. "Historical records," Torres said slowly. "Anthropological data, psychological profiles, educational documentaries." He looked up at the Admiral. "She's rejecting the prototype weapons demonstration." Admiral Chen was 72 years old, a veteran of the first contact conflicts where humanity had defended its colonies from pirates and raiders. She had spent 4 decades building Earth's defense forces from a scattered collection of national militaries into a unified command structure. She knew weapons, strategy, logistics. This request made no sense. "I'll contact her," Chen said, but Torres held up a hand. "There's more, Admiral. She specifically requests that we compile materials on human warfare throughout history. She wants everything from tribal conflicts to the world wars to modern asymmetric warfare. She's asking for footage of battles, casualty statistics, documentation of last stands and Pyrrhic victories." He paused. "She wants us to show them what we've done to ourselves." The Admiral was quiet for a long moment, and Torres could see the understanding slowly dawning in her eyes. "She's not going to show them a weapon," Chen said softly. "She's going to show them us." Over the following weeks, the galaxy watched as the 5 challenged species prepared their demonstrations. The Vexthari constructed a massive testing facility in an empty system, their crystalline ships gathering like strange geometric flowers around a small moon. The Talgoran Federation mobilized their drone production facilities, churning out millions of autonomous war machines. The Xel'Nath sealed their demonstration area with biohazard warnings, and even other species' long-range sensors could detect the terrifying bioforms being cultivated within. The Chorus Unity, a hive-minded species that communicated through harmonic frequencies, assembled a fleet around a barren planet. When they activated their resonance weapons, the planet literally tore itself apart, its core exposed to space as tectonic forces beyond anything natural ripped through it. The demonstration was watched by representatives from across the galaxy, and the message was clear. The Chorus could end worlds, but humanity. Human activity was confined to Earth and a few research stations. There were no weapons tests, no fleet mobilizations, no ominous construction projects. Intelligence agencies across the galaxy, not just the Drexars, monitored human communications and found nothing but requests for historical data, meetings with academics, and the compilation of educational materials. "They're preparing to submit," one Drexar analyst reported to Zhal'rix. "All evidence suggests they've realized they cannot compete and are preparing a diplomatic presentation to negotiate favorable surrender terms." Zhal'rix wanted to believe that analysis. It fit the pattern of species that understood they were overmatched. But something still bothered him about Ambassador Vasquez's calm acceptance of the challenge. He had watched her negotiate for years, had studied recordings of her diplomatic work. She was skilled at reading opponents, at finding leverage in seemingly hopeless situations. She never entered a negotiation without a strategy. What strategy could she possibly have with no weapons to show? The other 4 demonstrations proceeded on schedule. The Vexthari displayed their ability to fold space itself, crushing a Drexar test fleet that had been provided for the purpose. The technology was impressive, but the Drexar had encountered reality-warping technology before and had developed countermeasures. Warlord Kyrex offered alliance terms, with the Drexar clearly the senior partner. The Vexthari, after careful calculation, accepted. The Talgoran showed their drone swarms, billions of autonomous machines that could overwhelm any defense through sheer numbers. Again, impressive, but the Drexar had faced similar technology and knew its weaknesses. Alliance terms were offered, and after negotiation, accepted. The Zhal'rix revealed bioweapons that could sterilize entire ecosystems in days. Terrifying, but the Drexar's environmental suits and decontamination protocols were advanced enough to mitigate the threat. The Zhal'rix also accepted alliance terms. Only the Chorus Unity refused the Drexar's offer. They were an ancient species, proud and convinced of their superiority. Their resonance weapons were powerful enough to shatter planets, they argued. No force in the galaxy could stand against them. The Drexar invasion of Chorus space began 3 days later. It took the Hegemony 6 days to reach the Chorus homeworld, bypass their resonance weapons through a combination of dampening fields and sacrificial shield ships, and establish orbital control. The Chorus Unity, which had existed for over 10,000 years, effectively ceased to exist as an independent power. The message to humanity and the rest of the galaxy was clear. Impressive weapons weren't enough. The Drexar had faced everything, adapted to everything, and conquered everything. Resistance was futile. As humanity's deadline approached, a vigil-like atmosphere settled over the Galactic Assembly. Species that had grown to appreciate humanity over the past 3 centuries prepared themselves for what many believed was inevitable. The humans had become friends to much of the galaxy, not through military might but through genuine interest in other cultures. They remembered festivals, learned languages, helped solve problems that weren't their own. They were merchants, engineers, mediators, storytellers. They were in many ways the glue that held the younger species together, and now they would likely have to submit to the Drexar, or worse, be destroyed. Dr. Sarah Chen, a historian specializing in human conflict, sat in the human delegation's quarters on the assembly station, reviewing the presentation one final time. She was 41 years old, had spent her entire adult life studying warfare, and had written 3 definitive books on military history. She had never imagined her life's work would be used like this. Are we doing the right thing? She asked Dr. James Okonkwo, the psychologist who had been brought in to analyze the psychological aspects of human warfare. Okonkwo was older, 63, with gray hair and tired eyes that had seen too much human suffering in his work with trauma survivors. I don't know, he admitted. We're about to show the galaxy the worst aspects of our species. We're going to strip away the friendly, diplomatic facade and show them what we're really capable of. That knowledge can't be ungiven. Ambassador Vasquez thinks it's our only chance, Chen said. Ambassador Vasquez is betting that the Drexar are rational enough to be frightened by what we show them, Okonkwo replied. That's a dangerous bet. What if it just convinces them they need to destroy us before we become a threat? They didn't have an answer to that question. Neither did Vasquez, though she had spent 30 sleepless nights thinking about it. The day of humanity's demonstration arrived. The Grand Assembly Chamber was filled beyond capacity, with species that normally attended via hologram insisting on being present in person. This was, everyone believed, a historic moment, one way or another. Ambassador Vasquez entered with a small delegation, Captain Torres, Dr. Chen, and Dr. Okonkwo. No weapons, no prototype technology, no fleet waiting in the wings. Just 4 humans with a presentation device. Warlord Kyrex's mandibles clicked in amusement. Ambassador Vasquez, where is your demonstration? I see no weapons, no fleet, no technology. You asked to see our most fearsome weapon, Warlord, Vasquez replied, her voice steady. We're here to show you. She activated the presentation device, and holographic displays materialized throughout the chamber, visible from every angle, accommodating the various visual spectrums of the Assembly's diverse species. Humanity has been in space for 300 years, Vasquez began. We are the youngest species in this assembly. Most of you have been exploring the stars for millennia, but before we came to space, we spent 10,000 years on our homeworld, and for most of that time we were at war. The first images appeared. Ancient battles, Stone Age humans fighting with crude weapons over territory and resources. The violence was shocking in its brutality, hand-to-hand combat with stone axes and spears. We began as any species does, Vasquez continued. Competing for resources, defending territory, establishing dominance hierarchies. But something about humanity was different. We didn't just fight for survival, we fought for ideas. The images shifted to show religious wars, crusades, holy conflicts where humans killed each other over differences in belief systems. The assembly watched in uncomfortable silence as the death toll mounted, thousands, then tens of thousands. We fought over which god to worship, Vasquez said. Over which economic system was correct, over which political philosophy should dominate. We took abstract concepts and made them worth dying for. The holographic displays showed the world wars, industrial-scale carnage that made several species in the assembly physically recoil. Trenches filled with bodies, cities reduced to rubble, death camps, atomic weapons. The numbers were staggering. Millions dead in the first global war, tens of millions in the second. This was one species, Dr. Chen said, stepping forward. One world. We did this to ourselves. While other species developed space travel and occasionally fought limited wars, humanity spent 10 millennia perfecting the art of warfare. We are 300 years into space travel and 300 centuries into learning how to kill each other efficiently. The images continued. Vietnam, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria. Asymmetric warfare where small groups with inferior technology fought superpowers to a standstill through sheer refusal to surrender. Insurgencies that lasted decades, bleeding vastly superior forces dry through determination and guerrilla tactics. Zhal'rix, watching from the Drexar section, felt something he rarely experienced: uncertainty. He had studied hundreds of species' military histories. Most developed organized warfare after achieving space travel, as they encountered other species and competed for resources. But humanity had been fighting organized wars for thousands of years before they left their planet. They had refined tactics, strategy, and weapons technology in an endless cycle of conflict against themselves. "Let me show you something specific," Vasquez said, and the displays shifted to show last stands throughout human history. Thermopylae, where 300 Spartans held a mountain pass against a Persian army of hundreds of thousands, fighting to the last man. The Alamo, where fewer than 200 defenders chose death over surrender. Stalingrad, where Soviet forces fought for every building, every street, in a battle that lasted over 5 months and killed nearly 2 million people. "Humanity doesn't surrender easily," Dr. Okonkwo said, his voice heavy with something that might have been pride or might have been shame. "We have a psychological quirk that most species lack. When faced with impossible odds, when logic dictates submission, humans often choose to fight anyway. Not because we think we can win, but because we cannot bear to give up." The displays showed more recent events. Suicide bombers, kamikaze pilots, soldiers volunteering for missions they knew were one-way trips. The galaxy was witnessing something they had never truly understood about humanity: their willingness to die for causes they believed in. "During our Second World War," Chen said, "one of our nations, Japan, employed kamikaze pilots. These were men who volunteered to load their aircraft with explosives and crash them into enemy ships. They knew they would die. They wanted to die if it would help their cause. Nearly 4,000 men volunteered for these missions." The assembly was silent now, the earlier murmuring completely gone. Species that had known humanity as friendly traders and skilled diplomats were seeing something they had never imagined. "Here's what you need to understand," Vasquez said, and her voice cut through the silence like a blade. "Everything we've shown you, we did this to each other, to our own species. We fought wars lasting years, decades, even centuries over parcels of land, over ideas, over whose imaginary friend was real. We came within minutes of destroying our entire civilization with nuclear weapons, multiple times, and survived only because at the last second, someone chose restraint over annihilation." She paused, letting that sink in. "We killed each other by the millions. We developed weapons capable of ending all life on our planet. We fought wars so brutal that the survivors were traumatized for generations. And we did all of this to ourselves, to other humans, people who shared 99.9% of our DNA. The displays shifted one final time, showing Earth as it was now. Peaceful, unified, its cities gleaming, its people living in relative harmony. The contrast with the previous images was jarring. "It took us 10,000 years," Vasquez said softly, "but we finally learned to stop. We unified our species, we created laws and institutions to prevent the worst of our impulses, we chose cooperation over conflict, we became civilized." She turned to face Warlord Zhal'rix directly. "But don't mistake civilization for weakness. Don't think that because we've learned to live in peace with each other, we've forgotten how to fight. Every human carries the same DNA as those soldiers at Thermopylae, those pilots at Pearl Harbor, those insurgents in Afghanistan. We have simply chosen not to be those people." Dr. Okonkwo stepped forward. "Warlord Zhal'rix, you asked to see our worst weapon. Our worst weapon is us. It's what we become when you give us no other choice. You've seen what we did to each other over ideas, over land, over beliefs. Now imagine what we would become if you gave us something we've never had before, a unified purpose, a common enemy, a reason to stop fighting each other and focus all of that capacity for violence outward." The chamber was so quiet that the hum of the air processors seemed loud. 347 species held their collective breath, waiting for what would come next. "We have spent 300 years in space," Vasquez said, "building friendships, establishing trade, learning about your cultures and sharing ours. We've been good neighbors, good partners, good friends. We've shown you our art, our music, our stories. We've helped solve problems, mediated disputes, built things together. That's who we choose to be." She took a step closer to the podium where Zhal'rix stood. "But if you invade us, if you give us no choice but to fight, you will force us to become something else. You will face a species that spent 10,000 years learning every possible way to kill each other and has spent 300 years carefully not using that knowledge. You will face a species that doesn't surrender, that fights for ideas more fiercely than resources, that produces soldiers willing to die if it means taking you with them." The displays flickered, showing one final image, a quote from a human philosopher projected in the common language. "Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster." "We've fought our monsters," Vasquez said quietly. "We've beaten them, controlled them, locked them away. But they're still there, inside every human, waiting. And if you force us to fight, Warlord, you'll be the one who lets them out. You asked to see our worst weapon. Our worst weapon is what we become when you give us no alternative. Is that really something you want to discover firsthand?" She stood there, this one human woman, staring down the representative of a military empire that controlled 40% of the known galaxy, and waited. Warlord Zhal'rix's expression was unreadable to most species, but Zhal'rix knew him well enough to see the calculation happening behind those multifaceted eyes. The Warlord hadn't expected this. None of them had. "The hegemony requires time to analyze your presentation," Zhal'rix said finally. "We will recess for one planetary rotation." As the assembly dissolved, Zhal'rix was already running calculations in his mind. He needed to get back to the hegemony's flagship, needed to run simulations, needed to understand what they had just witnessed. Aboard the Drexar flagship Eternal Conquest, Zhal'rix assembled his top analysts and fed humanity's historical data into their military simulation AI. This AI had predicted the outcome of every Drexar campaign for the past 50 years with 97% accuracy. It could model fleet movements, predict resource allocation, calculate casualty rates, and determine victory probabilities with frightening precision. "Run Scenario 1, Zhal'rix ordered. Traditional invasion of Earth, orbital superiority followed by ground forces." The AI processed for several minutes, far longer than usual. When the results appeared, Zhal'rix felt his exoskeleton grow cold. Initial victory probability, 87%. Occupation stability probability, 12%. Projected occupation duration, 47,320 years. Projected hegemony casualties, 40% of total military capacity. Conclusion, military victory achievable, successful occupation unlikely. "Explain the occupation stability rating," Zhal'rix demanded. The AI displayed its reasoning. Human historical patterns indicate high probability of sustained insurgency. Species demonstrates willingness to accept extreme casualties in asymmetric warfare. Cultural values emphasize resistance to oppression. Projected human tactics include guerrilla warfare, terrorism, sabotage, economic disruption, propaganda, and suicide attacks. Occupation forces would require constant vigilance and reinforcement. Cost-benefit analysis. Negative. Run Scenario 2, Zhal'rix said, his voice tight. Orbital bombardment of military targets. Occupation of human colonies only, leaving Earth isolated. Again, the AI processed. This time the results were even worse. Probability of human surrender, 3%. Probability of total economic warfare, 98%. Human colonies and sleeper agents throughout galaxy will conduct sabotage operations. Projected damage to hegemony infrastructure, severe. Human species has demonstrated capacity for long-term resistance. Isolating Earth will not eliminate threat, will instead create distributed insurgency across all hegemony space. Zhal'rix felt something he had rarely experienced in his decades of military service, fear. Not fear of losing a battle or even a war, but fear of what victory would cost. Scenario 3, he said quietly. Full genocide, destroy Earth, eliminate all human colonies, hunt down human civilians throughout the galaxy. The AI processed for nearly an hour. When it finally produced results, it did something Zhal'rix had never seen before. It flagged the scenario as incalculable. Insufficient data to predict outcome. Human response patterns exceed normal warfare parameters. Species has demonstrated capacity for total commitment to ideological causes. Psychological profiles indicate genocide attempt would unify human species completely and eliminate all restraints on warfare methods. Available data suggests humans would accept mutual annihilation over submission. Warning: this scenario has highest probability of hegemony defeat or mutual destruction. Recommendation: do not engage. One of Zhal'rix's analysts spoke up. Sir, there's something else. We've been analyzing human economic integration over the past 3 centuries. She displayed a complex web of relationships. Human engineers maintaining critical systems across hundreds of worlds. Human traders facilitating commerce between species that mistrusted each other. Human mediators preventing conflicts before they started. Human cultural exchanges building bridges between alien civilizations. Humanity hasn't just been trading with the galaxy, the analyst said. They've been integrating themselves into it. They're not the most powerful or the richest, but they've made themselves necessary. If we attack humanity, we won't just be fighting them. We'll be destabilizing the entire galactic economy. Species that depend on human expertise will face infrastructure failures. Trade routes will collapse. And humanity has spent 3 centuries building friendships. How many species would aid them, not because of military alliances, but because humans helped them once, remembered their holidays, learned their stories? Zhal'rix stared at the web of connections and finally understood what Ambassador Vasquez had done. Humanity hadn't spent 3 centuries in space building a military. They'd been building something far more powerful, relationships. They'd made themselves simultaneously too valuable to lose and too dangerous to attack. There's one more thing, sir, another analyst said hesitantly. We analyzed the presentation itself. Ambassador Vasquez showed us wars, atrocities, weapons. But she also showed remarkable restraint in what she didn't show us. Explain, Zhal'rix demanded. The worst of human atrocities were mentioned but not displayed in detail. The Holocaust, Unit 731, the Rwandan genocide, and others. She referenced them but didn't show us the full extent. She indicated there were things worse than what we saw, things that violated assembly content regulations. Zhal'rix understood immediately. Vasquez had shown them enough to frighten them, but not so much that it would trigger outrage or seem like a threat. She'd calibrated the presentation perfectly, terrifying enough to make the Drexar reconsider, restrained enough to seem like a warning from a friend rather than a threat from an enemy. It was masterful diplomacy, and it made Zhal'rix respect humanity even as it frightened him. He compiled all the data, all the simulations, all the analysis, and brought it to Warlord Zhal'rix. The Warlord reviewed it in silence, his forearms motionless, his mandibles still. "Your recommendation, Intelligence Coordinator," Zhal'rix asked finally. "Withdraw the challenge," Zhal'rix said without hesitation. "Humanity is not a species we can conquer at acceptable cost. More importantly, they're not a species we want to fight. Everything in their history suggests they will resist to the point of mutual destruction. They don't fight for survival, they fight for principle. That makes them unpredictable in ways our models cannot account for." Zhal'rix was silent for a long time. Finally, he spoke. "We built the hegemony by knowing which battles to fight and which to avoid. We've never lost a war because we've never started a war we couldn't win." He stood, all four arms gesturing in a pattern that meant resolution. "Prepare my statement for the Assembly. Humanity has passed our test." The next day, the Grand Assembly reconvened. The chamber buzzed with speculation and anxiety. Most species expected Zhal'rix to demand humanity's submission or announce an invasion. Some hoped for a miracle. Warlord Zhal'rix took the central podium, and the chamber fell silent. "The Drexar Hegemony has conquered 40% of this galaxy by understanding warfare better than our enemies," he began, his voice carrying to every corner of the vast space. "We calculate costs, predict outcomes, and strike only when victory is certain. This is not cowardice. This is the essence of strategic superiority." He turned to face the human delegation. "Ambassador Vasquez, you and your colleagues have shown me something I have never encountered before. Every species the hegemony has conquered fought to protect what they had: territory, resources, populations. They fought for survival, and when survival became impossible, they surrendered. This is logical. This is rational." He paused, and Zhal'rix, watching from beside him, could see the grudging respect in the warlord's posture. "But humanity," Zhal'rix continued, "you have shown me a species that doesn't fight for survival. You fight for principles, for ideas, for causes you believe in. You have shown me a species willing to accept mutual annihilation rather than submit to what you perceive as injustice. You are a species that has come within moments of destroying itself multiple times and survived only through conscious choice, not inability." The chamber was absolutely silent now. Every species present was hanging on the warlord's words. "This makes you the most dangerous species in this galaxy," Zhal'rix said flatly. "Not because you have the most powerful weapons, but because you cannot be reliably predicted. Rational species can be defeated through superior force. Irrational species can be manipulated through their own chaos, but a species that is rational enough to build civilization, yet willing to abandon rationality for strongly held beliefs, that is an enemy no strategist wants to face." He gestured with all four arms, a sign of respect in Drexar culture. "The Drexar Hegemony has built an empire by knowing which battles not to fight. Ambassador Vasquez, I withdraw my challenge. The hegemony has no quarrel with humanity, and we will ensure we never give you cause to become the weapon you described." The assembly erupted in shocked conversation. The unstoppable Drexar hegemony had just backed down without a shot being fired. Species throughout the chamber were trying to process what had just happened. Ambassador Vasquez stood slowly and inclined her head. "Thank you, Warlord Zhal'rix. For what it's worth, I'm grateful we didn't have to find out who was right about what would happen." There was something in her tone, a weight that made Zhal'rix study her more carefully. She wasn't triumphant. She wasn't even particularly relieved. She seemed uncertain. After the formal session ended, Zhal'rix requested a private meeting with Vasquez. They met in a neutral conference room, just the two of them and their translators. "Tell me truthfully, Ambassador," Zhal'rix said. "If I had invaded, would humanity have done what my simulations predicted?" Vasquez was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "Warlord, I'm going to tell you something that won't make you feel better. Our presentation showed you what we've done to ourselves throughout history. We held back the worst parts because they would have violated assembly regulations on acceptable content. We didn't show you the full details of our genocides, our torture programs, our most horrific weapons. We are capable of atrocities that would disturb even your warriors." She met his eyes, and Kyrek saw something in her expression that chilled him despite his exoskeleton. But here's the thing about humanity. We're also capable of incredible compassion, sacrifice, and mercy. We've produced monsters and saints, sometimes in the same person. Every human carries both capacities inside them. The only reason we've survived as a species is that we've learned, slowly and painfully, to choose the better path more often than the worse one. She leaned forward slightly. But if you had invaded us, if you had given us no option but to fight for our survival, our freedom, our very existence, if you had forced us to choose between submission and becoming monsters, she paused, and in that pause Kyrek understood. She didn't know. Even she, the architect of this masterful diplomatic strategy, didn't know whether humanity would have become the nightmare she'd shown him or found some way to remain civilized even in total war. And that uncertainty, that fundamental unpredictability, was more terrifying than any weapon could be. "I see," Kyrek said quietly. "You showed me your history and let me draw my own conclusions, knowing I would conclude that the risk was too great." "I showed you the truth," Vasquez corrected gently. "Everything in that presentation was real. Those wars happened. Those casualties were actual people. That capacity for violence exists in every human. I didn't lie or exaggerate, I just made sure you understood what you'd be facing." "And now," Kyrek asked, "what will humanity do with this victory?" Vasquez smiled, and it was a tired smile. "The same thing we've been doing for 300 years, Warlord. We'll trade, build, explore, and learn. We'll continue being the species that remembers your cultural festivals and helps solve problems. We'll keep choosing to be civilized." She stood to leave, then paused. "But now the galaxy knows that civilization is a choice we make, not a weakness we suffer from. And maybe that's not a bad thing for them to understand." Back on Earth, Captain Torres found Ambassador Vasquez in the observation deck of the UN headquarters, staring out at the planet below. It was night over Europe, and the lights of 1,000 cities glittered like stars. "You did it," Torres said. "You faced down the Drexar Hegemony without firing a shot." "I terrified them with the truth about who we are," Vasquez replied quietly. "I'm not sure that's something to celebrate, James." "Did we bluff them?" Torres asked. "Would we really have become what you said we'd become?" Vasquez was silent for a long moment, watching Earth turn slowly beneath them. "I don't know," she finally admitted. "I'm grateful beyond words that we didn't have to find out. The scariest thing about that presentation, every word was true. We are capable of all of it. We've done all of it before." She turned to face Torres. "Our ancestors spent 10,000 years learning to be warriors. We've spent 300 years learning to be something better. I'd like to think we've evolved past our worst instincts, that we've grown beyond the species that fought world wars and built doomsday weapons. But honestly..." She looked back at Earth, at the peaceful, unified world that humanity had built after so much bloodshed. "I don't know if I believe that. Somewhere inside every human is still that ape that learned to throw rocks and build spears. We've just gotten very, very good at keeping it locked away. And I think Warlord Kyrek saw that doubt in my eyes, that uncertainty about whether we'd succeeded in domesticating ourselves. And that doubt terrified him more than any weapon we could have shown him." Torres was quiet, processing this. "So what now?" he finally asked. "Now we prove him right to back down," Vasquez said firmly. "We continue being the species that builds rather than destroys, that mediates rather than fights, that chooses mercy over vengeance. We keep that monster locked away where it belongs." "And if someone else challenges us?" Torres asked. "If the galaxy thinks we were bluffing?" Vasquez's expression hardened slightly. "And we'll give them the same choice we gave Kyrek, back down or find out if we were bluffing. And we'll pray they make the smart choice, because I really, really don't want to discover which version of humanity emerges if we're pushed too far." In the days and weeks that followed, the galaxy processed what had happened. The Drexar Hegemony's withdrawal from the challenge became the most discussed event in recent history. Diplomatic relationships shifted as species reconsidered their understanding of humanity. Some species became more cautious around humans, newly aware of the capacity for violence that lurked beneath their friendly exterior. Others grew closer, respecting humanity's restraint and appreciating that they had chosen peace even when they possessed the capacity for terrible war. The economic integration that humanity had been building for 3 centuries accelerated. Species that had viewed humans as useful but unremarkable suddenly saw them as essential partners. Trade agreements were renegotiated, this time with humans holding more leverage. Defense pacts were proposed, with multiple species offering mutual protection agreements. But perhaps the most significant change occurred within the Drexar Hegemony itself. Zhal'rix found himself promoted to Grand Strategic Coordinator, his analysis of the human situation having impressed the hegemony's leadership. His first major policy recommendation was unexpected: begin diplomatic outreach to humanity. If we cannot conquer them, Zhal'rix argued before the hegemony's ruling council, then we should ensure they remain our friends rather than becoming our enemies. Humanity has shown they can integrate peacefully with hundreds of species. They have also shown they have the capacity to become the most dangerous enemy we've ever faced. The logical choice is clear. The council agreed, and within 6 months, the Drexar Hegemony and humanity had established formal diplomatic relations. Trade began cautiously, then expanded. Cultural exchanges followed. Drexar military strategists found themselves fascinated by human military history, studying humanity's wars the way scholars studied ancient texts. One such strategist, a young officer named Kelvix, requested permission to visit Earth and study at its military academies. The request was approved, and Kelvix became the first Drexar to attend the United Nations Military Academy in Brussels. On his first day, he found himself in a class on military ethics taught by a human professor named Colonel Sarah Martinez. She was a veteran of the colonial defense forces, had fought in 3 separate conflicts and carried the scars to prove it. War, Martinez told her class of human and alien students, is not glorious, it's not noble. It's not something to be celebrated or sought after. War is what happens when every other option has failed, when diplomacy and reason and compromise have all broken down. It's what we do when we have no choice left. She pulled up a holographic display showing casualty statistics from Earth's world wars. The numbers were staggering, and Kelvix found himself transfixed by the scale of destruction humans had inflicted on themselves. My great-great-grandfather fought in World War II, Martinez continued. He survived D-Day, fought through France and Germany, saw the concentration camps. He lived to be 93 years old, and until the day he died, he had nightmares about what he'd seen. That's what war does. It breaks people, even the winners. She turned to face the class directly. So why do we study it? Why do we train for it? Why do we maintain armies and fleets and weapons we hope we'll never use? A human student raised her hand. Because if we're not prepared, someone else will make the choice for us. Exactly, Martinez said. We study war so that we can prevent it. We prepare for violence so that we can deter it. We maintain the capacity for destruction so that we never have to use it. That's the paradox of peace. Sometimes you need to be capable of terrible things to prevent those things from happening. After class, Kelvix approached Martinez. Colonel, may I ask you a question? Of course, Cadet Kelvix. Ambassador Vasquez's presentation to the Assembly, he said carefully. The one that convinced Warlord Kyrex to withdraw his challenge, was it? Was it true? Would humanity really have fought the way she suggested? Martinez was quiet for a moment, and Kelvix could see her weighing her response. I don't know, she finally said. I'd like to think we've grown past that we've evolved beyond our worst instincts. But I've seen what humans are capable of when they're desperate, when they're fighting for something they believe in. I've seen soldiers run into certain death to save their comrades. I've seen civilians take up arms to defend their homes against impossible odds. I've seen people choose to die rather than surrender their principles. She met Kelvix's eyes. So would we have become the nightmare that Ambassador Vasquez showed your warlord? I don't know. But I'm grateful we didn't have to find out, and I'm grateful that your warlord was wise enough to ask himself that same question. Kelvix nodded slowly. Intelligence Coordinator Zhal'rix, my mentor, says that the mark of a great strategist is knowing which battles not to fight. Your mentor is a wise being, Martinez said. War should always be the last resort, not the first option. The goal isn't to win every fight. The goal is to make sure the fights never happen in the first place. Over the following years, this philosophy spread throughout the galaxy. The incident became known as the bloodless deterrent, a case study in how the threat of war could prevent war. Diplomatic academies across hundreds of worlds taught courses on Ambassador Vasquez's presentation, analyzing her strategy, her psychology, her perfect calibration of threat and restraint. But the impact went deeper than just diplomatic theory. Species throughout the galaxy began to reconsider their assumptions about power and strength. The Drexar Hegemony, having learned that conquest wasn't always the answer, began to transition from pure military expansion to a more balanced approach that included diplomacy and economic integration. It wasn't a quick change, and it wasn't always smooth. The hegemony's warrior culture didn't adapt easily to the idea that sometimes not fighting was the stronger choice. But slowly, over decades, the galaxy began to shift toward a new equilibrium. Humanity, for its part, continued to be humanity. They traded, explored, built, and mediated. They maintained their defense forces but never used them aggressively. They continued to be the galaxy's engineers, traders, storytellers, and friends. They proved, day after day, that the monster Ambassador Vasquez had shown the galaxy was real but contained, powerful but controlled. 20 years after the challenge, Ambassador Elena Vasquez, now retired, sat in a cafe in Geneva with Zhal'rix, who had become a regular visitor to Earth. The Drexar and the human had developed an unlikely friendship based on mutual respect and shared experience. "I've been asked to write my memoirs," Vasquez told him, sipping her coffee. "They want me to explain what I was thinking during the presentation, how I came up with the strategy. Will you?" Zhal'rix asked, his translator rendering his clicking speech into perfect English. "I don't know," Vasquez admitted, "because the truth is, I wasn't entirely sure it would work. I was betting everything on the hope that the Drexar were rational enough to be frightened and wise enough to step back from the brink." "You were betting on us being smart enough to recognize a threat we couldn't quantify," Zhal'rix said. "That was a dangerous gamble." "Alternative was to fight a war that nobody could win," Vasquez replied. "That seemed more dangerous." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching humans and aliens walk by on the street outside. It was a common sight now, dozens of species mingling peacefully in Earth cities. "Can I ask you something I've always wondered?" Zhal'rix said. "That moment when you stared down Warlord Kyrex, when you asked him if he really wanted to find out what humanity would become if forced to fight. What were you feeling?" Vasquez thought about it for a long moment. "Terror," she finally said. "Absolute terror, because I wasn't sure I was bluffing. I've studied our history, Zhal'rix. I know what humans are capable of when we're desperate. I know we've committed atrocities that shame our entire species. And I know that somewhere inside every human is the capacity to do those things again if we believe we have no choice." She turned to look at him. "I was terrified that you'd call my bluff and force us to find out whether we'd become the monster I described or whether we'd found some way to fight without losing our humanity. Either outcome frightened me." "But you didn't show that fear," Zhal'rix observed. "No," Vasquez agreed. "I couldn't, because if Kyrex had seen fear, he might have interpreted it as weakness. I had to show certainty, confidence, the absolute conviction that humanity would do exactly what I said we'd do. I had to make him believe it completely." "You succeeded," Zhal'rix said quietly. "The simulations showed we couldn't win, not at any acceptable cost. But it was your certainty, your complete conviction, that truly convinced Warlord Kyrex to withdraw. He believed you knew exactly what humanity would become because you spoke with such confidence." Vasquez smiled sadly. "Then I'm a better actor than I thought. Because I was making it up as I went along, hoping I was right about your warlord being smart enough to be scared." They finished their coffee in silence, two old diplomats who had once faced each other across the most important negotiating table in galactic history, and somehow managed to avoid catastrophe. As Vasquez walked home that evening through the streets of Geneva, she thought about the burden she had carried for 20 years, the secret she'd shared with Zhal'rix. She had convinced the galaxy that humanity was too dangerous to attack by showing them the truth of what humans had been. But she had never answered the question that haunted her. What would humans actually have become if forced to fight? She didn't know. After 2 decades of peace, She still didn't know. And she had made peace with the fact that she would probably never know, because the only way to find out would be to face exactly the scenario she had spent her career trying to prevent. Perhaps that was the true genius of the bloodless deterrent, she thought. Not that she had bluffed the Drexar into backing down, but that she had created a situation where nobody wanted to find out if it was a bluff. The uncertainty itself was the weapon, more powerful than any fleet or bomb. She looked up at the stars beginning to appear in the evening sky. Somewhere out there, on thousands of worlds, species that had once viewed humanity as weak or naive now saw them differently. They saw a species that had clawed its way up from the mud of prehistory, that had nearly destroyed itself a dozen times, that had learned through terrible suffering to choose peace over war. But they also saw a species that remembered how to be monsters if they had to be. A species that would fight for what they believed in, that wouldn't surrender even when logic dictated they should. A species that was simultaneously the galaxy's best friend and its worst potential enemy. And as long as everyone remembered that, as long as the uncertainty remained, as long as nobody wanted to find out what humanity would really do if pushed to the edge, then the bloodless deterrent would continue to work. Vasquez smiled to herself and continued walking home. The monster was still locked away, exactly where it belonged. And with luck, with wisdom, with continued commitment to peace, it would stay there. But if it ever needed to come out, if humanity was ever truly threatened with extinction or enslavement, if some species was ever foolish enough to force the question that had terrified the Drexar Hegemony, well, Vasquez thought, then the galaxy would finally get its answer. And she suspected that answer would be worse than anyone imagined, because the reality of human warfare, unrestrained by civilization's gentle hand, would make her presentation to Warlord Zhal'rix look like a children's story. But that was a bridge she hoped humanity would never have to cross. The point of deterrence wasn't to fight the war. It was to make sure the war never happened in the first place. She reached her apartment and looked one last time at the stars before going inside. "Stay safe," she whispered to the galaxy. "Stay smart, and please, please don't make us show you what we really are." The stars twinkled back at her, silent and eternal, holding the secrets of 300 civilizations. And among them, one small blue world where a species had learned to lock its monsters away, but never quite forgot where it kept the key.